The Petersons' home stood tall among the oaks of Forest Hills, exuding grandeur and charm. To neighbors, Michael and Kathleen Peterson embodied the American dream, a brilliant novelist and a high-powered business executive, thriving together in a house that seemed to echo laughter and success. Yet, appearances can deceive. Beneath the polished veneer, cracks had begun to form. That evening, the Petersons hosted close friends for a casual dinner. Kathleen's laughter rang loud, her animated stories captivating everyone around the table. Michael, ever the storyteller, added his wit and charisma to the mix. But as the hours ticked by, Kathleen's smile faltered. Her colleagues had been relentless lately, and financial pressures loomed over her head at work. After the guests left, the house grew eerily quiet. Kathleen poured herself another glass of wine and retreated to the library, flipping through spreadsheets on her laptop. Michael, meanwhile, settled on the patio, his phone glowing faintly in the darkness. An email lingered unread, a message from a secret part of his life that he had desperately tried to keep hidden. Midnight crept in. Kathleen emerged from the library, the glow of her laptop casting a faint light across her face. "Michael," she called out, her voice sharp with irritation. "We need to talk." He turned, startled, but before he could respond, she disappeared toward the staircase, the sound of her steps echoing through the hall. Minutes later, the silence shattered. A crashing thud erupted from the staircase, followed by a frantic scream. Michael bolted toward the noise, his voice trembling as he shouted Kathleen's name. At the base of the stairs lay her lifeless form, blood pooling beneath her head, stark against the wooden floor. His hands fumbled for his phone. 911, he whispered, his voice cracking. "My wife. She fell. She's not breathing." He choked back a sob, repeating the address as if speaking it aloud could somehow undo what had just occurred. The paramedics arrived swiftly, their radios crackling with urgency. Yet the scene that greeted them felt off, unnatural. Too much blood, too many questions. One paramedic whispered to the other, their eyes narrowing. Outside, the red and blue lights danced across the trees, painting a stark contrast to the dark night that had fallen over the Peterson household. The flashing lights outside the Peterson home painted the once tranquil neighborhood in eerie streaks of red and blue. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Paramedics worked silently, their movements deliberate, while Detective Sarah Connolly arrived on the scene, her sharp gaze scanning every detail. Michael sat on a nearby couch, his hands trembling as he clutched a tissue. His shirt was spotless, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked stairs where Kathleen's body had been found. "She fell," he repeated softly, his voice monotone, eyes vacant. "It must have been the wine. And her shoes." Connolly crouched by the staircase, her practiced eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. The blood told a different story, a large stain spread out unevenly, splatters marking the walls. It wasn't consistent with a simple fall. She leaned closer, tracing the patterns in her mind. "Did you move her?" Connolly's voice broke the silence, sharp and deliberate. Michael blinked, startled. "Yes, I tried to help her," he stammered. "She wasn't breathing. I thought..." Connolly murmured, cutting him off. She gestured for the paramedics to proceed but didn't move her gaze from Michael. Something about his calm demeanor, his deliberate choice of words, didn't sit well with her. The paramedics lifted Kathleen's body onto the stretcher. One of them paused, lowering his voice. "This amount of blood doesn't seem right." His colleague nodded, their eyes meeting briefly before continuing their work. Connolly stepped closer to the stairs, studying the scene. A small dent in the wall caught her attention, just above where the bloodstains were heaviest. It looked deliberate, out of place in the otherwise pristine home. She reached out, running her fingers along its edge. "Bag this section," she ordered one of the forensic officers. "And get samples from the walls." As they worked, a neighbor peeked through the front door, her face pale. "I heard something earlier," she said hesitantly. "Around midnight. Yelling, maybe. I didn't think much of it at the time." Connolly turned sharply, her interest piqued. "You're sure it was yelling?" The neighbor nodded, but added nothing more, retreating into the shadows. Meanwhile, Michael had moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. His hands shook as he sipped, his eyes darting toward the stairs. Connolly followed him, her footsteps purposeful. "We'll need a formal statement," she said flatly. "Tonight." Michael looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he replied, his voice hollow. Connolly didn't miss the brief pause before he answered. The forensic team continued their meticulous work. A faint smear of blood on the kitchen sink caught Connolly's eye. "Collect this," she instructed, her tone clipped. Another inconsistency, another question mark in an already puzzling scene. As the night deepened, Connolly stood at the foot of the stairs, her mind racing. Something here was off, terribly off, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, the Peterson home was cordoned off, its once welcoming doorway now overshadowed by the grim scene inside. Detective Connolly returned early, her instincts pulling her back. The faint morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the bloodstains still marking the stairs. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Michael sat in the living room, his eyes sunken and red-rimmed. Across from him, his two sons, Clayton and Todd, flanked him protectively. "Dad didn't do anything wrong," Todd said firmly, his voice cracking under the weight of his conviction. Connolly observed them quietly, her notebook resting on her knee. "We're just gathering facts," she replied evenly, though her gaze lingered on Michael a beat too long. Candace Zamperini, Kathleen's sister, arrived shortly after. Her presence was electric, her anger barely contained. "She would never fall like that," Candace said, her voice sharp. "Something happened, and you know it." She pointed directly at Michael, who flinched but didn't respond. Connolly watched the interaction, noting the dynamic shift in the room. As tensions grew inside, the forensic team outside worked meticulously, sifting through bins and scanning every corner of the property. One officer approached Connolly with a small evidence bag containing torn paper. "We found this in the office trash," he said. Inside the bag was a crumpled piece of Kathleen's planner, with the words, "Talk to Michael," scrawled across it. The date matched the night she died. Connolly's brow furrowed as she studied the note. "Bag it and log it," she instructed, her tone clipped. This could mean everything or nothing, but it added another layer to the growing complexity of the case. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere in the Peterson home had reached a boiling point. Candace and Michael's eldest son, Clayton, clashed in the kitchen, their voices rising. "You're blind!" Candace snapped. "He's hiding something and you're too scared to see it." Clayton stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You don't know anything about our family," he fired back. Connolly intervened, her voice firm. "Enough. This isn't helping anyone." As the day waned, Connolly retreated to her car, her thoughts racing. The evidence was mounting. Kathleen's injuries, the suspicious bloodstains, and now the torn note. But one piece was still missing: motive. Her gut told her there was more to uncover, something deeper, something darker. Detective Sarah Connolly stood at the base of the stairs, her gaze fixed on the crimson stains that stretched up the wall like a sinister roadmap. Each drop, each splatter whispered a story waiting to be decoded. Around her, the forensic team moved in a practiced rhythm, collecting samples and snapping photographs under the sharp glare of portable floodlights. Dr. Aaron Hale, the forensic blood spatter analyst, crouched beside the largest pool. "This isn't consistent with a fall," she muttered, her gloved fingers tracing a dark line where the blood had smeared. Connolly knelt beside her, her curiosity piqued. "What are you thinking?" Hale straightened, pointing toward the nearest wall. "See the velocity here? This isn't passive dripping. It's impact spatter, multiple blows, not a single event." Connolly's stomach tightened. "And the pattern?" she pressed. Hale hesitated. "It's unusual, almost like she was trying to move away, maybe defending herself." Nearby, an officer called out, "Detective, you'll want to see this." Connolly approached, finding a forensic bag containing a long, hollow object covered in a faint layer of dust. It was the missing blowpoke, the very item Candace Zamperini had insisted Kathleen treasured. The handle bore faint traces of red. "Test it for blood and fingerprints," Connolly ordered, her voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. In the Petersons' library, Michael sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together. His lawyer, David Rudolph, had arrived and was seated beside him, his demeanor calm but calculated. "They're building a case," Rudolph warned softly. "The blood, the blowpoke, they'll try to connect it all." Michael's face remained unreadable. "It's not what they think," he murmured, almost to himself. Rudolph leaned in, his voice low. "Then tell me what it is, Michael. Because if you don't, they'll decide for you." As the forensic team continued their work, Connolly moved to the kitchen where another officer held up a sealed bag. Inside was a kitchen towel stained with a faint streak of red. "Found it in the laundry," he explained. Connolly examined the bag closely, noting the uneven smears. "Bag it," she said tersely. "Add it to the chain." Returning to the stairs, Connolly's mind raced. Hale's analysis, the blowpoke, the blood-soaked towel, all pieces of a puzzle that still refused to fully align. She glanced back at the stairs, the chilling realization setting in. Kathleen hadn't just fallen. She had been in a fight, a violent one. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Connolly lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply as she stared at the house. "This is far from over," she whispered, the words carried off by the cold evening breeze. Detective Connolly sat in her office, a stack of files spread across her desk. Among them was an old case file from 1985, its manila folder yellowed with age. At its center was a name that sent a chill down her spine: Elizabeth Ratliff. The circumstances surrounding her death bore an uncanny resemblance to Kathleen Peterson's. Both women had died at the bottom of a staircase. Both deaths were connected to Michael Peterson. Elizabeth's case, ruled as a natural death at the time, had been filed away without much scrutiny. But now, as Connolly flipped through the pages, questions surfaced. Elizabeth had been Michael's close friend when he lived in Germany. After her death, he had assumed guardianship of her two daughters, Martha and Margaret. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. "Exhume the body," Connolly instructed, her voice resolute. The medical examiner, Dr. Thompson, looked up from the file with a skeptical gaze. "This was nearly 2 decades ago," he cautioned. "You're certain?" Connolly nodded firmly. "We need answers." Days later, the exhumation took place under the somber gray skies of a German cemetery. The body was transported back to Durham for analysis. When the results came in, the findings were shocking. Elizabeth's injuries mirrored those of Kathleen, multiple fractures on her skull consistent with blunt force trauma. Connolly felt her chest tighten as she read the report. Could Michael have been involved in both deaths? The revelation sent ripples through the Peterson family. Martha and Margaret, now adults, were blindsided by the connection. "He loved her," Martha insisted during a tense interview. "He would never hurt Elizabeth." But her voice wavered, uncertainty creeping in. Margaret sat silently, tears streaming down her face. Michael, confronted with the evidence, was steadfast in his denial. "Elizabeth's death was a tragedy," he stated, his tone measured. "And now you're twisting it into something grotesque." His lawyer, David Rudolph, quickly intervened, calling the evidence circumstantial and irrelevant. "You can't put him on trial for something that happened in another country almost 20 years ago." Connolly wasn't convinced. The similarities were too striking, too precise. "It's not about the timeline," she said later to her team. "It's about the pattern." The connection to Elizabeth Ratliff had cast a new shadow over the Peterson case, one that deepened the mystery surrounding Michael. That night, Connolly found herself back at the Peterson home, staring at the staircase where Kathleen had died. The walls, scrubbed clean of blood, seemed to whisper the unanswered questions that still haunted the case. As she turned to leave, a thought struck her. What if there were more connections, more threads linking Michael to other tragedies? The weight of the investigation pressed heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just chasing a suspect, she was chasing a legacy of death. The courtroom was abuzz with murmurs, a low hum of disbelief as David Rudolph stood at the center, his expression calm but his words incendiary. "Ladies and gentlemen, I propose an alternative explanation for Kathleen Peterson's death, one that may seem unconventional but is rooted in evidence." He paused, letting the tension build before delivering his next words. "An owl attack." The gallery erupted into whispers, the prosecution visibly scoffing. Judge Stevens rapped his gavel to restore order. Rudolph continued undeterred, projecting an image onto the courtroom screen, a close-up of Kathleen's scalp. "Notice these lacerations," he pointed. "They're linear, parallel, and consistent with talon marks." Detective Connolly, seated in the back, leaned forward, her brow furrowing. She had heard the theory in passing, but dismissed it as a desperate tactic. Yet, as Rudolph spoke, he wove a narrative compelling enough to hold even her skeptical attention. He explained that barred owls, common in the Peterson neighborhood, could attack when provoked. Their sharp talons could inflict deep wounds, and their feathers, lightweight and nearly invisible, might go unnoticed in chaotic circumstances. Then came the physical evidence. A single microscopic feather found in Kathleen's hair and traces of pine needles near the staircase. The jury's expressions were a mix of intrigue and doubt. The prosecution, seizing the moment, stood to counter. "So, you're asking us to believe that a wild bird flew into the house, attacked Mrs. Peterson, and somehow caused her to fall down the stairs?" District Attorney Greg Howard's tone dripped with sarcasm. "It's absurd," Rudolph countered swiftly. "I'm not asking you to believe anything without evidence, but this feather, this pattern of injuries, cannot be ignored." His voice was steady, commanding the room's focus. Outside the courthouse, media frenzy swirled. Headlines ranged from "Owl Defense Genius or Insanity" to "Michael Peterson's Legal Gamble." Connolly, observing from the sidelines, felt a tug of unease. The owl theory was fantastical, yes, but also plausible enough to plant doubt, and doubt was all the defense needed. That night, Connolly sat alone, replaying the day's proceedings in her mind. The evidence pointed one way, but the theory, a wild, improbable twist, had left her unsettled. For the first time, she questioned if her certainty in Michael's guilt had blinded her to other possibilities. The courtroom felt suffocating as the trial pressed on. Days had turned into weeks, and tension hung heavy in the air. Witness after witness stepped forward, each adding their piece to the puzzle. But today was different. Today, a surprise witness emerged, and the atmosphere shifted. The defense had called Martha Ratliff to the stand, one of Michael Peterson's adopted daughters. She appeared poised, but a flicker of uncertainty danced across her features. "Mr. Peterson loved my mother," Martha began, her voice steady yet filled with quiet conviction. "He took us in when we had no one else. He's not capable of such violence." The prosecution pounced immediately. "Miss Ratliff, are you aware that your mother's injuries mirror those of Kathleen Peterson?" District Attorney Greg Howard's voice was sharp, calculated. Martha hesitated. I've heard that," she admitted, "but it doesn't prove anything." Howard pressed on. "Isn't it true that you've had doubts about Michael Peterson's involvement in your mother's death?" The courtroom buzzed, and Martha's composure cracked. "No," she exclaimed, but her voice wavered. The damage was done. The focus shifted as the prosecution called a surprise rebuttal witness, a neighbor who had previously been silent. Mrs. Turner, an elderly woman with a stern demeanor, took the stand. "I live across the street," she began. "On the night Kathleen died, I saw shadows moving near the Peterson home around midnight. 2 figures, not one." The courtroom erupted. Connolly, seated in the gallery, felt her pulse quicken. 2 figures, her mind raced. Had someone else been involved, or was Michael working with an accomplice? The revelation shattered the established narrative, opening a floodgate of possibilities. Howard seized the moment. "Mrs. Turner, why haven't you come forward until now?" She glanced toward the defense table, her expression grim. "I didn't think it mattered, but after seeing all of this unfold, I had to speak." Michael's face remained a mask, but his hands gripped the edge of the table tightly. Rudolph leaned over, whispering something urgent, but Michael didn't respond. The ripple effect was immediate. Jurors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. As the day closed, Connolly reviewed the new testimony. The case had become murkier than ever. The owl theory, Elizabeth Ratliff's death, the shadowy figures, all of it swirled in her mind like a storm refusing to settle. The tides had turned indeed, but where they would lead remained an unsettling mystery. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Each step echoed like a drumbeat. The collective breath of the spectators held in anxious suspense. Michael Peterson sat at the defense table, his face pale but composed, his hands clasped tightly together. David Rudolph leaned in, whispering something, but Michael gave no indication he'd heard him. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Stevens entered, his stern expression offering no clues. The foreperson stood, a folded piece of paper in hand, trembling slightly. Connolly watched intently from the gallery, her pulse quickening. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Peterson, guilty of murder in the first degree." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Michael closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening, but he remained motionless. Candace Zamperini, seated near the front, let out a sob of relief, her hands flying to her face. Kathleen's family clutched one another, tears streaming down their faces. Across the room, Martha and Margaret Ratliff sat stunned, their loyalty to Michael unwavering, but now shaken. The judge addressed Michael directly. "Mr. Peterson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel struck, finalizing the decision. As Michael was escorted out of the courtroom, his expression unreadable, reporters outside scrambled for coverage. Headlines lit up within minutes. Michael Peterson convicted of wife's murder. Public opinion was polarized. Some celebrated the verdict as justice served, while others questioned the case's integrity. Back at the police precinct, Connolly reviewed her notes. The evidence had been damning. The blood patterns, the blow poke, the inconsistencies in Michael's story. Yet something gnawed at her. The shadows, Mrs. Turner mentioned. The missing motive. The owl theory. It all lingered in her mind like an unfinished puzzle. Years later, cracks in the case began to surface. A forensic expert who testified for the prosecution was discredited, accused of falsifying credentials in multiple cases. The media seized upon the revelation, and Michael's legal team moved quickly, demanding a retrial. In 2011, the conviction was overturned. Michael walked out of prison on bail, a free man for the first time in 8 years. The courthouse steps were swarmed with reporters. "Mr. Peterson, do you have anything to say to Kathleen's family?" a journalist called out. Michael paused, turning to face the cameras. "I've said it before. I did not kill Kathleen, and I never will admit to something I didn't do." But the fight wasn't over. As the appeals process loomed, so did the questions. The truth, it seemed, was as elusive as ever. The air in the Peterson home felt heavy, even after years had passed. The trial, the conviction, and the overturned verdict had left scars too deep to heal. Michael Peterson, now older and grayer, sat in his study. The faint glow of his desk lamp illuminating papers sprawled across the surface. His offered plea had spared him more time behind bars, but it hadn't granted him freedom from suspicion, or himself. Detective Sarah Connolly had moved on from the case but couldn't shake its lingering shadow. Late one night, a knock on her door startled her from her routine. A former colleague handed her a sealed envelope. "This came from Kathleen's old work files," he said cryptically. "Thought you'd want to see it." Connolly opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter written by Kathleen, dated just weeks before her death. It was addressed to her lawyer, but never sent. The words leapt from the page, their urgency palpable. "I need to discuss something important regarding Michael. I feel unsafe. He's hiding something." The letter was incomplete, its tone ominous, but its meaning unclear. Connolly felt a familiar knot in her stomach. She reached for her phone, but stopped herself. The case was closed. Kathleen's death had been ruled manslaughter under the plea agreement, but this letter added a layer of unease to an already complicated puzzle. Meanwhile, public opinion remained sharply divided. Documentaries and think pieces dissected every detail of the Peterson saga. To some, Michael was a victim of a flawed justice system. To others, he was a cold-blooded manipulator who had escaped true accountability. The truth, it seemed, depended on who you asked. Martha and Margaret Ratliff, steadfast in their belief in Michael's innocence, avoided the media. Candace Zamperini, however, spoke openly about her lingering pain. "We'll never get her back," Candace said in a televised interview. "But the world needs to remember who Kathleen was, not just how she died." Connolly placed the letter in her desk drawer, her thoughts racing. There were no new leads to pursue, no loose threads to pull, just a cold, unsettling truth. The story of Kathleen Peterson's death was one the world would never fully understand. And perhaps, Connolly thought bitterly, that was the greatest tragedy of all. The Peterson case refused to rest, much like the owls that haunted its narrative. Years after Michael's release, a retired investigator named Tom Reddick revisited the evidence, driven by a stubborn curiosity that refused to fade. His findings would reignite the embers of a case many thought had burned out. Reddick had spent months reanalyzing footage and reports. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source, surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera, thought irrelevant at the time. The grainy video didn't show the Peterson house clearly, but the timestamp matched the night Kathleen died. Two figures moved faintly in the shadows. The footage was unclear, but the motion was unmistakable. The discovery prompted Reddick to dig further. He contacted an ornithologist, Dr. Lila Graham, an expert on barred owls. "The feather found in Kathleen's hair," Reddick explained, "could it truly belong to one?" Dr. Graham examined the evidence and confirmed it. The feather was a match. She added a chilling detail. "Barred owls can be aggressive if they feel threatened. Their talons are sharp enough to pierce human skin." Reddick felt the pieces clicking into place. The owl theory, dismissed as absurd, suddenly seemed plausible again. Yet it raised a troubling question. If an owl attack had initiated Kathleen's fall, how had her injuries escalated into something so brutal? Meanwhile, Michael Peterson remained steadfast in his offered plea, living quietly but still under the shadow of suspicion. The media had moved on to newer scandals, yet the Peterson saga remained a staple for true crime enthusiasts. Documentaries rehashed the case, fueling speculation with every retelling. Was Michael a murderer? Or had the world failed to grasp a bizarre truth? The footage, coupled with Reddick's findings, caught the attention of Detective Connolly. Though retired, she couldn't resist one last dive into the case. Meeting with Reddick, she reviewed the evidence. The shadows in the footage gnawed at her. Were they proof of an accomplice, a bystander, or merely a trick of light? As Connolly stood on the familiar staircase, she reflected on the layers of the case, the bloodstains, the blowpoke, the owl theory, and now the surveillance video. Each piece told a story, but none provided a definitive answer. Kathleen's death was a tragedy ensnared in ambiguity, a narrative both riveting and maddening. Connolly ran her hand along the banister, her mind replaying the timeline. Kathleen had lived, loved, and died here, in this house, surrounded by secrets that would never fully reveal themselves. The truth wasn't just unresolved, it was untouchable. As she left the Peterson home for the final time, the evening air carried the faint call of an owl. Connolly paused, glancing toward the treetops. The sound faded into the night, leaving her with a bittersweet thought. Perhaps some stories were never meant to be untangled. What do you think of Michael Peterson and the mystery surrounding Kathleen's death? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know. How would you rate this story on a scale from 0 to 10? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime tales.